Hello, everybody. I know I'm right before lunch, so I'm gonna move this down first. I know I'm right before lunch, so I won't rush, but I will be aware of my deadline. So I was asked to talk today to really cover trends, benchmarks, but also we've been through lots of waves of new technology recently. So what have we learned from securing these new waves of technology that we can then apply to containers? What's the same and what's different? Here are my most frequently asked questions. My favorite was when I got in an inquiry with a client and they said, it's starting to feel like the wild, wild west again. How the heck do I get control over containers? And isn't this going to be even worse when I move to serverless? So the first thing I get asked is, how do I secure them? How do I prioritize it? The next thing is, what makes securing containers different than virtual machines? Didn't I just go through this? Can't I apply what I did there over here? Oh. The next one is, how can I automate it? I can't do this. I've got 50 different development teams that are using containers. I can't do this with the people that I have. Application security people are notoriously rare. So how do I do this and still automate it? And then the last thing is, okay, every single vendor says they can solve container security. What's the relative maturity and what are they really doing? Because I can't figure it out. This is some of our data about where we are with container adoption. So the interesting thing is 13% of teams say that every single team uses containers. 28% says they are using, and some teams are using, and they plan to expand. And what this means is 63% of teams use containers in some sort. They may not be expanding, but they're using containers in their organizations. My favorites are the don't knows. So, DevOps, it's been mentioned a few times. One of the things we can learn from and hopefully take advantage of is the automation of a development pipeline. That's how we automate security. So where are we with DevOps? You know, interestingly, these numbers are actually slower than they were last year. And we've got some theories floating around at Forrester. What does this mean? Is DevOps failing? Are we seeing the peak? Is it gone? And our assumption is no, it's not, but that what we saw was a burst of development teams claiming that they did DevOps, and then there were some struggles. And so teams are sort of taking a step back and almost going to put it into low gear so that then they can achieve bigger release speeds in another year or two. So we actually hope to see these numbers reverse a little bit. But as you can see, we still have kind of the 25%ers hanging out at half yearly or longer, but about a third of the organizations are releasing monthly or faster. And from our research, those folks really have embraced DevOps. You can't get to monthly or faster unless you've done automation of some kind. Release automation, build automation, you can't get there without DevOps. And I like the 35% that are building multiple times per day or at check-in. So 5 years ago at Forrester, we were trying to convince clients to adopt cloud, not because it was cheaper, but because it would enable release speeds. Fast forward to today, and we see that here in North America, we've got a significant portion, about 60% of organizations actually adopting public cloud, which is great. Now, what we saw in previous iterations was that they tried it out first. They did private cloud. And then they usually did some sort of hybrid, and then eventually they migrated fully out into public cloud. And when we talked to security folks, of course, the first answer was no. Then they got steamrolled, which is a good thing. And then it was, okay, so how do we protect our applications as they move to the cloud. And the first concern, of course, was data. Where is it going to live? Does it move out of our systems of record inside our data centers, or does it actually move out into the cloud? So security really focused primarily on the data. If our systems of record hang back and they live in our data center, then it's all about securing the data in transit. If the data is going to live in the cloud, then you probably had some security people who were about to pass out, but eventually they got over it. Okay, how do we protect our data in the cloud? And that's how we started out. And then we got used to it, and then more applications and more applications. And now we're here today. When I showed the Aqua folks this slide, there was a lot of, oh my goodness. So 76% of our respondents said that they would characterize their cloud strategy as hybrid. And 53% actually say they have 5 or more cloud providers. And this was evident when we started talking to clients and we said, okay, well, what are you planning for your cloud strategy? And a lot of folks said, you know what, I may be getting the best deal today, and I know I adopted cloud for performance reasons, but I may be getting the best deal from a particular cloud provider today, but I'm not going to sacrifice money later on. I may need to change. And so there's this idea of flexibility. I want to move. I want to be able to switch between cloud providers. I want to adopt many cloud providers. Now, of course, security pros, it's not just about the data. Where does it live? How do I secure it in transit? Now it's how do I make consistent security policies across possibly 5 or more different cloud providers? So it went from I'm going to secure the one-on-one transaction to now I've got many applications out in the cloud on to now I've got a governance problem. And how do I make sure that that cloud environment, wherever it may live, is secure? So here's a sample of some of the tools that can be used in a DevOps chain. You'll see some security products sprinkled in there. This slide is great because it's complex, but as you look at it more, there's more and more information to be gleaned here. So you could be using Jenkins to do builds, for example. You could be using release automation tools to actually push the code out into the cloud. The trick about all this fantastic automation is it almost gives us a secure or a false sense of security. We put it there, and therefore it is what we put. However, for security people in the back of our minds, one of the things we need to think about is not only is if we push out a misconfiguration, now we've pushed it out a lot to many different places, but also, is it really still what we put out there? Because if an attacker can get in and change our code, they will. The other thing is as we do this orchestration, you know, when we put the first applications out on the public cloud, we probably did it manually. Today, that's an impossibility. We can't do that. But with our orchestration, Jenkins, or with our release automation tools, we have to remember no code is perfect. Nothing is perfect. So that means that our orchestration tools are also susceptible to vulnerabilities and issues. So we have to be aware of the fact that, for example, Jenkins can be used for crypto mining. Jenkins could also be used to place code that is not yours, is an attacker's out if you're not careful. So as we think about how do we secure new technologies, the thing that we also have to remember in the back of our minds is our automation tools could actually be used against us, and how could they be? So I've already shown you data. Most of it is from our developer surveys. We do these huge surveys with thousands of respondents. This is actually from our security survey. We ask, have you suffered a breach? And 40% of the respondents were brave enough to say, we have suffered a breach. Now it's anonymous, so that probably helps. But 40% of them said we had an external breach. So we also ask if you've had an internal breach. This is 40% of folks said they had an external breach. And then we do one click down and we say, okay, so you've had an external breach. How did it happen? The first way it happened, and they can choose multiple responses, the first way it happened is through software weaknesses. Think SQL injection, cross-site scripting, the two big ones. The next level was vulnerabilities. Last year, those two were swapped. So number one was vulnerabilities, and number two was weaknesses. It's almost as if we've decided to roll out the red carpet to malicious attackers and say, right here, this is how you're going to get in. And of course, the bad thing about attackers being able to get in through our applications is it doesn't matter how much encryption you put on your data or how many network security walls you put up. If an attacker can get into your app, they have all the access to the data and the networks that app has. So that means our apps become critical points that attackers want to attack. So another part of my research is actually on bots. So little pieces of code attackers can generate to try to probe applications. A recent survey showed that every single addressable internet location was attacked. Every single one. And I'm going to summarize Brian Krebs here and say all of your websites are being pen tested, whether it's by you or it's by attackers. So when you think about that and you think it's your applications that are getting probed, do you have SQL injection? Do you have cross-site scripting? Are there the problem with responsible disclosure is our CVEs go out to our attackers too. And there's enough information in there for them to generate a very quick bot and start probing out there. Do you have this vulnerability? And then of course, once they can get in, then they can steal your data. We also asked number of times you were breached. And I want you to notice the 2% that were brave enough to say that they were breached 25 times or more in a single year. But you'll see that actually, it's usually more than once. Now, people who don't know security look at this and they say, how could that possibly be? Once you have that first breach, haven't you learned your lesson? At which point I have to say, you have no idea the scope here. The number of applications, especially in recent years, the attack surface has exploded for many of you in this room. Where attackers can get in, how they can attack. And it's not a simple, oh, I'm going to plug this one hole and it's going to fix this. Once again, because applications come with inherent weaknesses and vulnerabilities, you face this problem. I won't ask anybody to raise their hands if they're one of the 2%. So what have we learned? What have we learned from the fact that our applications are breachable? What have we learned from these past evolutions in recent technologies? What can we take with us? If you talk to a CISO, they're going to say, okay, in an ideal situation, these are the steps I'm going to take. Step one, I'm going to protect the production environment. I have no idea what my development team has done. They are usually the last to know that something has happened. In fact, I was on an inquiry call with a client, and they had just done a discovery about serverless functions, and the CISO told me that he could have sworn that they had no serverless functions out in production. There was no way he would know. They had just done a search, and sure enough, found that they are indeed running serverless functions in production. And so he said the minute he gets off the phone with me, he was going to go and figure out how to protect serverless functions. So when you talk to a CISO, the first thing they're going to say, okay, I'm the last to know. How do I shore up production? How do I at least put some basic controls out there so that I know at least I've got some basic protections? The next thing they're going to say is, where's the data? Because that's ultimately what they're trying to protect. They're not trying to protect the app. They're trying to protect the data that the app is either collecting, producing, using. The next thing they'll do, once they've shored up the data, is how do I automate this? Are there things I can do pre-release that will help the application as it's out in the wild facing customers and attackers alike? And the last thing they're going to do is optimize. How do I govern this? How do I make it consistent? How do I make sure that I've evened out all the holes, plugged all the different areas that we can think of? I did a survey as I've been listening to the talkers. My mind works in Venn diagrams, and I was thinking, what I really wanted to do was create a Venn diagram about what I was talking about and what everyone else was talking about to find the overlap. What are we all recommending as our 10 basic steps? Do they correspond? So if I make that Venn diagram, I'll make a blog for you. But these are the 10 steps that I found are the basic controls you have to do when you're securing containers today. And I put it in reference to where you can do it in your software delivery lifecycle. Some things you can do before build. Unfortunately, with containers, a lot of those things you have to put a pause on until the container is actually instantiated. So you have to wait until test. It can't be done pre-release, for example. Because developers can put anything in a container, and to me, mystery meat in your container is the biggest threat that you have, because literally they could just put anything they want in that container. And that's what's making security pros feel like they want to pass out these days, is the idea of what that mystery meat could be. But as they look at these 10 steps, there are things in here that you have to wait to do, like vulnerability scanning, that in previous iterations with normal website code, for example, non-containerized code, you could do instantiation of the code pre-build, but unfortunately today you have to wait. So there's some delay in what you can do with your security, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it pre-release. You definitely still should. But there are lots of things in here, like using trusted images. Those things you probably aren't going to do from step one. As the CISO gets notified, oh, by the way, 5 different teams are using containers, and we have been for the last 6 months, the first thing they're going to do is probably not use trusted images. They're probably going to start focusing on, like I said, how do we control this? So this isn't a dream world. CISO gets told, hey, those 5 teams have been running containers for the past 6 months. What are we going to do? Honestly, a CISO is probably going to go for the low-hanging fruit. Knowing that mystery meat is the biggest threat to a container, they're probably going to start doing vulnerability scanning. Why? Because they're probably already doing it for other applications. This is a well-known problem to solve. I know how to put it in a DevOps pipeline, and I'm getting rid of my biggest security risk, which is those vulnerabilities inside of those containers. So in a dream world, they're probably thinking, how do I insert those controls in a production environment? But truthfully, they're probably going to go for the easiest first. Then they'll go back and shore up things like, what do I need to do in the production environment? Now, I've been asked repeatedly, okay, so I've done this for VMs. Can I just take things like user authentication, my networking controls? Can I just plop that in here? And in fact, many organizations, they call it cheating. They will actually run containers on VMs because then they get to inherit all those good security controls they've already done. Nothing wrong with that. Go for it. Don't forget to harden the OS. I know a few speakers have already mentioned hardening the OS. Yes, you can blow it away and reinstantiate just in case something has changed. Part of the benefits of using the pipeline, that's great. But also don't forget, once again, no software is perfect. There will be an OS vulnerability announced. Dirty cow, anyone? So you need the ability to instantiate new versions of OS, just like you do for your new code. So don't forget that as you do your prep for how do I secure containers. Moving on to automated, of course there's scanning, which you've probably already done because it's a low-hanging fruit. But there's also things like signing of images so that you know what you have put out there still is the thing that you put out there. And then, of course, secrets management. You just don't want secrets floating around and passwords. I know it's an easy way to put a password in clear text. Happens to the best of us. But certainly secrets management is a big one. And then the last one is how do I optimize? So when a CISO discovers that 5 different teams have done containers and now it's their job to try and go in and secure them, shore them up, there's already a bazillion containers out there. So they do not have the luxury of testing it out with one container and figuring out what this means, so on and so forth. They will immediately have to move into governance. They will immediately have to move into automation. and how do I use orchestration tools to make sure things like I'm not promoting misconfigurations. So I just recently put out a paper about container security. And I discovered a ton of tools, which is why I keep getting questions about, okay, Amy, every vendor tells me they can solve container security. Who are they and where do they sit? I divided the vendors up. First, this is based on size, and then I'll show you by functionality. So these are all the vendors that I could find who do container security, or at least claim some piece of the puzzle. I then broke it down by functionality. Remember those 10 steps? If they covered up to 4 of those steps, they were a specialist. If they covered 10 or even more, they had other areas they covered that I didn't, then they were all the way at the other end and they were a platform. And then of course you've got the folks in the middle. So what are the differences? The platforms really focused on things like making sure they were consistent, that they had all the different areas covered. Oddly enough, the folks in the middle covered policy better than even the platforms did in general. But as you look at this, you probably have, in fact, I'm going to back up a stage. If you look at this list, my bet is you have several of these vendors in-house. So my recommendation is always, first, take stock of what you have. Find out what piece of the whole puzzle these vendors are providing, and then figure out what you need to buy. Because, for example, you may already have vulnerability scanning to the nth degree. Do you need to buy something new? Probably not. What you already have probably already scans containers. Plop it in, done. If there are other things like secrets management that you need to fill in, then take a look at which vendors provide secret management. They probably provide other spots, other areas. If you really have very little, a platform provider is going to give you most, if not all, of those functions that you need to provide right off the bat. Then you've got a single vendor. So some key takeaways. Containers, of course, everyone sitting in this room knows this. Containers have gained traction with developers. They're very excited about them. And why not? Containers give developers a way to buffer their work from everyone else's. It's the true benefit of loosely coupled architecture to the nth degree. It's usually paired with microservices, which is fantastic. But the thing to know is that applications are still your biggest weakness. It's still your Achilles heel in your environment, are those very apps that those containers are delivering. You can secure these applications, but it does take a full lifecycle approach, and it's not just one tool, it's several tools that are going to help shore this up. And when you look at the breadth of vendors who are covering container security, if they say they solve container security, I hope you look at them a little askance. You have a resting kind of face. And you push and you really say, okay, what part of those steps do you really cover before you then dive in and do a full evaluation? And that is me. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Why don't we take 1 or 2 questions before we break for lunch, if you're good with
Sounds
that?
great.
Anybody? Questions for Amy? Or not, people want to eat. That's
wanna
okay
eat.
with me too. We got one quick question, then I do want to make an announcement about lunch and how you get that, so we'll take one quick question.
So when we are running the images in these cloud environments, we should just worry about the container security, or what about the images security?
I'm sorry, what about the what security?
Securing the images, Docker images.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word.
Docker images, how do we
Okay.
secure them?
Yes? How do you secure Docker images? Or
I mean, these are about runtime containers, right?
Yes.
So we're all talking about whether it is Twistlock, Aquasec, they're all about container security.
Yes.
So what's the best strategy for the images, securing the images?
the security images such as?
how can I make sure my images are more secure? How do I store? So do we have any
So
strategy?
pre-release, how do you make sure that your containers are secure?
No, containers, how to secure the containers, I think we already got from what you got, like, but
Okay.
then the images, which are the underlying things.
Okay. In the registry? Okay, thank you. I'm having a hard time listening. My ears are. Anyway, so if you've got a registry of images and you want to say, this is our trusted images, is that where you're going? Okay. So a lot of the vulnerability scanners will actually work with the registries themselves. So you can actually collect them in a single location and say, developers, use from here. I've scanned them, I've okayed them, I've certified them. It does take people to do it. So I only see the most mature organizations doing kind of a trusted registry in-house because it does take human curation to make it. A lot of the vulnerability scanning tools have APIs that you can make use of to run the scanning so that you can download it and scan it. A developer's going to have to request. I see a lot of pushback from developers who think this is going to slow me down because if I need something that's not in the trusted registry, then somebody's going to have to go and look at it and pull it, and I've got to submit a formal request. But it does ensure that you have vetted everything that's in that registry. And so developers then can just pull directly from there, which is great. However, I will tell you, do not take out the vulnerability scanning inside the software delivery lifecycle, even if you have this is where developers should pull. Why? Because sometimes developers get creative and excited and they pull images from your non-trusted location, and you do want to ensure that anything that walks out in production is vulnerability free, at least to the level that you're comfortable with.
Okay, great. Yes. So thank you, Amy.